Welcome back, everyone. This is another Conversations on Anarres. I'm Dr. Joseph Orozco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and oppression. And we often have conversations with scholars, activists, and artists who are interested in helping us to imagine that possible future. My guest today is someone who's going to try to help us to understand this understudied but monumental figure in North American philosophy, revolutionary politics, and activism. He is someone who was key in fomenting the Mexican Revolution of 1910, but lived extensively throughout the United States, largely as a fugitive in exile from the Mexican government, but was someone who inspired Mexican-American politics along the borderland and was key for many different kinds of labor struggles. This figure, of course, is Ricardo Flores Magon. My guest today is Dr. Sergio Gallegos. He teaches philosophy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice for the City University of New York. And for the past few years, he has been working on studying the work of Ricardo Flores Magon, particularly his philosophical ethics and how they relate to his ideas of anarchism. But he is a specialist in Mexican philosophy in general. And so I've invited him to help us to understand a little bit about the influence and the work of Ricardo Flores Magon today. So Sergio, welcome to Conversations on Anarres. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jose, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here on the Anarres project, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, I've been wanting to do this for some time, and so, but I think that it's important to sort of note that one of the reasons that we're here talking now is that this year, 2022, marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Ricardo Flores Magon in a U.S. prison. So in the past few years, you've turned your attention and some of your work to trying to understand some of his complex thinking. And so he was a complex person, a propagandist of anarchist politics, but you have approached him as a sophisticated philosophical thinker. Um,
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you first, what brought you to Flores Magon? Who was he, and why were you attracted to study him as a figure for thinking about philosophical ethics?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Ricardo Flores Magon is one of the most important figures in Mexican history, insofar as both his thought and his actions are responsible for setting the ground for the Mexican Revolution. He was born in 1874 in Eloxochitlan, Oaxaca, which is an indigenous Mazatec community. Because of this, he was exposed during his youth to indigenous values and communal practices, which influenced in part the development of his political ideas concerning the need to develop an egalitarian anarchist commune where individuals would contribute their labor for the benefit of all rather than for the benefit of a privileged few, which is what happens in capitalism. Now, his parents, who had both fought against the French during the Second Franco-Mexican War, uh, impressed on him during his childhood and adolescence a fierce passion for freedom. And in addition to his parents, he was very deeply influenced during his early years at the National School of Jurisprudence by the writings of authors such as Mikhail Bakunin, Joseph Proudhon, or Pyotr Kropotkin. Now, his intellectual engagement with anarchist authors, along with his childhood experiences in Eloxochitlan, made him abandon his legal studies to immerse himself in a career in journalism and political activism, denouncing the oppressive dictatorial regime of Porfirio Diaz, which ruled Mexico for over 30 years. And despite being forced to flee Mexico in 1904 and live in exile in the US actually for the rest of his life, Flores Magon had an important role in the Mexican labor movement, as you mentioned, inspiring through his ideas conveyed in the newspaper Regeneracion, which he edited with his brothers and collaborators, the strikes of Rio Blanco in Veracruz and Cananea in Sonora, and his followers briefly occupied Mexicali and Tijuana in 1911, at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, creating short-lived anarcho-socialist communes. And to answer your second part of the question, what attracted me from Flores Magon is that he was not only an original thinker that managed to articulate distinct influences, in particular, as I mentioned earlier, his youthful experiences with indigenous values and practices, and his intellectual engagement with the thought of European and Russian anarchists into what I think is an original intellectual contribution uh, and a very interesting political project. But he was also a man of action, as you mentioned, an activist committed to fight for and to live in accordance with his ideals, which led him not only to being exiled in Mexico, but subsequently imprisoned in the US from 1918 until his death in 1922 at the Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. In fact, while in prison, he wrote this, and here I'm translating from the Spanish. When I die, my friends may write on my tombstone, here lies a dreamer. My enemies may write, here lies a madman. But no one will dare to write, here lies a coward and a traitor to his ideas, end quote. And for me, this is very attractive because very few people in the history of philosophy have had that kind of personal and intellectual courage. Socrates is one of the few other figures that comes to mind, but just basically a few others. And this is what made Flores Magon a really attractive figure for me to delve in.
Yeah, thank you for that background for our listeners and our viewers. I think that it's really interesting. There have been some very recent books, I know, studies in the United States about his influence in border politics, both in labor and then also as an influence in early Mexican American community organizing. So more attention is being brought to his work. But as you point out, in Mexico, his influence has been ongoing continuously, even still today, right? He was a big influence for the Zapatista uprising in
Indeed,
Chiapas
yes.
in the 90s, and continues to be an intellectual influence. So part of your work is to sort of look into that kind of that legacy and try to figure out what is the sophisticated philosophical thinking that he brings to thinking about what we'll call insurrectionist ethics later.
Indeed, yes.
So part of, as we've been talking about here, Flores Magon is known broadly for his political views, his notions of anarchism. Um, and people have been studying. I mean, one thing I'll say as a side is what I find really interesting is Flores Magon was really one of the very few, I think, folks in the kind of radical anarchist tradition to sort of think or postulate a little bit about what a post-capitalist, post-hierarchy society would look like, and often spent some time in his creative writing imagining the scenarios of what
Indeed, yes.
communes would look like in Mexico. So that's something I find really fascinating about his work. But so you, however, rather than sort of delve into his anarchism, want to sort of look at his radical ethics, and so you take him as an ethical theorist.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
so I was wondering what brings you to think of Flores Magon as an important ethical theorist?
Well, that's a fascinating question. So, what draws me to think of Flores Magon as an ethical theorist, beyond his contribution as a political theorist, is that in his political writings are infused with ethical reflections. And here I want to offer a couple of examples. For instance, in a manifesto that was published in the newspaper that he edited, Regeneración, on September 11th, 1911, after offering an analysis of the brutal exploitation that forces both urban workers to engage in theft or murder and poor women into prostitution to be able to feed themselves or their families, Flores Magon declares the following, and here I quote him: "It is the duty of us poor to work and struggle to break the chains that make us slaves. To leave the solution of our problem to the rich and educated classes is to put ourselves voluntarily in their claws." End quote. And in another passage of the same manifesto, he insists that given that the elderly, the disabled, and young children are often incapable of working, they should be supported by the collective labor of others, since a community has a duty to its most vulnerable members who cannot fend for themselves. So, given these passages, which are just part of the manifesto from September 1911, as well as many others throughout his works, it's clear for me that the political thought of Flores Magon is deeply connected with an ethical theory that is articulated around certain key values such as liberty and justice, and it highlights also certain duties and rights. And in particular, I think that one of the most valuable ethical insights of Flores Magon is that poverty is a kind of slavery, and that because of this, people have the right to revolt and overthrow a system that immiserates them, just as slaves have the right and the duty to revolt and overthrow their masters.
Wow. Okay. Um, in his political reflections, his notion, his ideas about social transformation, power, and change, and so forth, questions about social structures, then you find a commitment then to certain kinds of key values, and particularly strong values of communal care that
Hmm.
that seem to be importantly embedded in his notion of social change. And so this is why
Right.
you sort of think about
Yes.
him.
Hmm.
We need to sort of look at these kinds of ethical values imprinted in his political theory.
Hmm. Yes. In particular, one of the things that is most attractive to me is the notion of freedom that he articulates in his work, in light of the fact that for him, in order to be free, you need to be able not only to move without restraint or to vote without constraints, but also you have to be able to feed yourself without having to ultimately sell your work for, uh, as he puts it, putting a piece of bread in your mouth. And for him, and for me, this is extremely attractive because it shows that the notion of freedom that Flores Magon has is actually, in a sense, more radical than the one that we find in traditional exponents of liberalism, such as John Stuart Mill, given that for Flores Magon, liberty or freedom is really rooted in uh, an existential and material need to be able to ultimately just survive and feed oneself. If that is basically something that is absent, you are not really free. And this is, I
Uh,
think, a really interesting and potentially transformative idea.
Right, so that the idea of justice is more than simply a procedural one about fairness and
Hmm.
the sort of proper constraints on action within a system, but has to have real substantial uh, um, uh, outcomes in terms of the provision of care for a
Yes.
community.
Hmm.
Interesting. Well, so in the writings that you've done on Flores Magon so far, one of the things that you bring in to help understand him as an ethical theorist and to try to bring out some of these values that you're talking about is the framework of insurrectionist ethics.
Hmm.
And so this is a framework that's largely been developed through the work of folks like Leonard Harris
Hmm.
and our colleague Lee McBride.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could help us understand what is this framework about, insurrectionist ethics? What exactly does that phrase refer to? How should we understand the idea of an insurrectionist ethics?
Well, insurrectionist ethics is an ethical framework that, as you mentioned, was initially articulated by Leonard Harris, and that has been further developed by many of his students, such as our colleague Lee McBride, and also by another prominent student of uh, Leonard, Jacoby Carter. And in my view, and here I follow the exposition offered particularly by Harris in his early works, the core idea behind insurrectionist ethics is that any moral philosophy that offers advice, guidance, norms, or principles of action for being good, but that does not require for us to actively support slave insurrections or other forms of revolt or resistance against diverse forms of slavery or servitude is fundamentally defective. Now, this core idea can be developed or implemented in different ways that share common traits between them. And in particular, according to Leonard Harris and Lee McBride, there are four typical traits that seem to traditionally characterize the work of insurrectionary ethicists. The first one is a readiness to break norms that ultimately perpetuate oppression. The second one is an articulation of a notion of personhood that promotes action on behalf of oppressed people. The third one is the use of representative heuristics to create coalitions of resistance among the oppressed. And the fourth one is the praise of certain character traits such as guile or defiance or animosity that ultimately help oppressed groups to resist. And in my view, the use of representative heuristics is what is most remarkable in the works of insurrectionary ethicists, Flores Magon being included.
Great. So that's very interesting. So part of this idea, then, I guess, is that it's a critique of sort of traditional kinds of ways of thinking about ethics that says that any kind of ethical theory that in some sense does not support or provide foundation for um, opposition to
Mhm.
oppression of oppressed peoples or marginalized peoples in society is insufficient, right? So if we
Yes.
don't, if
Mhm.
in our ethics we don't take into consideration questions about social structures that create various forms of marginalization, servitude, unjust servitude, then
Yes. Mhm.
those are insufficient for the kind of work that we really want to do if we're concerned with
Yes.
questions like justice.
Exactly. And part of the reason for this is that many of the traditional and most well-known ethical theories, so Aristotle, Kant, John Stuart Mill, typically came from privileged backgrounds. And in light of this, uh, uh, the lived experience of oppression was not something that they ultimately had to contend with. And this is something that is manifest basically in the uh, systems that they ultimately put forth, which oftentimes either ignore or uh, actually embrace to some degree the existence of slavery. And here, a good example is basically Aristotle's views
Yeah.
on what he called natural slavery.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, so this sort of addresses the kind of in political theory that we often talk about, this kind of the odd sort of hypocrisy perhaps of liberalism that's so focused on questions about liberty and rights, but for hundreds of years was willing to tolerate the African slave trade and then
Mhm.
the servitude of African peoples, particularly in North America and in Latin America. So this is a way of pointing out the kind of the blind spots of these kinds of
Exactly.
theories.
Yes. Mhm.
So now that we have this kind of an understanding of this radical ethical position, in what sense do you think that Flores Magon is someone who's offering a kind of insurrectionist ethics? What does
Oh
this look
God.
like? How does this work out for him as a? How would you characterize him as an insurrectionist ethicist?
Wow. I could talk for hours about this. Because there's a lot to be said. But let me just give you a couple of brief examples. So, for instance, in his play Tierra y Libertad from 1917, Flores Magon has one of the main characters of the play, the peasant leader Marcos, address a group of soldiers who are mostly former indentured farmhands who were compelled to join the army and who have come to arrest him and his followers. And in his discourse to them, Marcos tells the soldiers that by doing that, if they were to ultimately arrest them, they would just be perpetuating their own oppression and that of their families, since the tribulations of the soldiers, in particular poverty, meager food, abuse and contempt from high ranking officers, which come from a different social class, are very much like the tribulations endured by the peasants and their families. So, by highlighting the situation of the soldiers and making them the representatives of the class of all poor workers, Marcos is able to persuade the soldiers to join them, thus creating a coalition of resistance. And another example of this insurrectionist ethics is the praise and promotion of a shared antipathy and aversion among all poor with respect to their oppressors. Indeed, according to Flores Magon, the aversion and antipathy, which he emphasizes in several places, not only in his plays, but also in some of the journalistic work, are positive features insofar as they can help spark the beginning and then fuel the unfolding of a social revolution that would be anti-authoritarian and egalitarian in nature.
So this is really interesting to me. I mean, on the one hand, I have some questions about this. So as you point out, a lot of the work that you're referring to is his creative work, right? So
Mhm,
you are interpreting the plays. So for folks who haven't read the obras of
mhm.
Flores Magon, right? It's a wide variety of different kinds of genres that
Right.
he that
Yeah.
and formats that he worked in. One, pamphlets, manifestos, journalistic pieces, and then also plays, as you mentioned,
Hmm.
and
Short
short
story.
stories,
Yes. Mhm.
poems. Right.
Yes.
So yeah, so he was very diverse in this kind of sense. And so your part of your work is actually trying to extract philosophical insights from his creative work.
Yes.
Does that provide? I mean, does that create a different layer of interpretation for you? Does that create a certain kind of any kind of problematic issue for you in trying to read his plays for philosophical insight?
Well, not really, because as I mentioned to you, uh, the lens that I have been using to read Flores Magon's work is insurrectionist ethics, and Leonard has been very attentive to the fact that uh, a lot of the figures that he has basically studied through this lens. So so Walker, for instance, but also other abolitionists, other U.S. abolitionists in the 19th century, wrote in a variety of different genres, correspondence, pamphlets, and a part of what I see myself doing is actually furthering the work that Leonard basically has done by showing that uh, just as there is a lot of philosophical value in non-traditional philosophical genres in U.S. Authors, there is also uh, a lot of philosophical value in works in non-traditional philosophical works in Latin American and Caribbean figures.
And this makes sense because I think in doing work in Latin American thought, you're going to find a lot of figures who are not writing the traditional kind of professional philosophical essays,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And so
Hmm.
we have to be more attentive to different forms of writing. And I know that you've been doing a lot of work, for instance, in the Mexican philosopher Sor Juana.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, so um, so trying to look at these kinds of writings in non-traditional formats is something that is necessary for this kind of work, right? To sort of look at the ways in which people are articulating perhaps the ideas of insurrection and creating these kinds of notions of of liberation. You'll have to find them in perhaps
Exactly.
non-traditional
Yeah.
sources.
Right. Yeah. Hmm. And this is something that I think is extremely valuable in the long run for the profession, given
Mm,
that it enables us to really expand our canon and include in the philosophical conversation figures that were deemed to be, for instance, in the case of Sor Juana, merely a poet
mhm,
or playwright, or in the case of Flores Magon, a journalist and
mhm.
activist.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because when you consider folks that were contemporaries of Flores Magon around this time in sort of different ways, talking about liberation from different standpoints. I'm thinking of folks like Jose Marti,
Mhm.
others, right? A lot of their work is in journalism.
Yes,
So it's something that we have to be attentive to.
yes. And I mean, since you mentioned Marti, another excellent example is the Afro-Cuban journalist and politician Juan Gualberto Gómez Ferrer, who
Yeah.
also wrote in non-traditional genres, and whose work, I think, has, just as in the case of Flores Magon, not been given the proper attention that it deserves from philosophers.
So, if I understand correctly, part of what you've been doing is looking at these plays and these writings, and you find in them Flores Magon talking about uh, uh, liberation of communities and by exhorting individuals to think about themselves in different kinds of roles and thinking about themselves to be empowered in certain kinds of ways that you find consistent with the framework of insurrectionist ethics, right?
Indeed.
That he's exhorting people to think about themselves in certain ways, and by thinking about themselves as agents in those kinds of ways, this can further than the social revolution that he envisions
Exactly.
in
Yes.
his political theory. So thinking about this idea of the way in which he's trying to empower individuals to think about themselves as willing to stand up to fight against oppressive norms, and to think about themselves as you put it, people who have character traits of guile, of sort of creative destruction of oppressive
Yeah.
social norms. Um, what do you think that this kind of study now offers us for thinking about social movements, but particularly in Latin America? I mentioned at the beginning of this that Flores Magon's legacy is well known in Mexico, but he's a
Mhm,
figure because he was part of such an intellectual figure for the Mexican Revolution,
mhm.
and continues to have a legacy in social movements there. But I'm wondering, do you think that this thinking about him as someone who offers insurrectionist perspective has something to provide for thinking about social movements or reform in Latin America and also in the United States and its social movements?
Ye
What is it that we
mhm.
can take from Flores Magon to help us think about social change today? In other words,
Okay. So, I mean, there are several lessons that I think Flores Magon can offer to us, both in Latin America and in the US, but I will just focus on a couple. So, for me, the first lesson that one can draw from his works is that poverty is not an individual choice that some individuals make or a dictate of fate that people who endure it must accept. For him, and this is something that is a recurrent idea in his works, poverty is like slavery or debt bondage. That is a social structure employed by within the capitalist system by a privileged few to control masses of dispossessed people in order to commodify their labor and to ensure their conformity and their obedience. And like slavery of debt bondage, poverty debases those that it affects by forcing them to engage in activities that degrade them. So theft, murder, prostitution, and the list goes on. So I think that this is something that I think is a very important lesson that we can draw from Flores Magon. The second one is that human beings are not impotent in the face of the immiseration created by the capitalist system. We can, through our actions, engage in different forms of insurrectionary activities, such as refusing to obey norms that perpetuate oppression, for instance, by refusing to be drafted into an army waging an imperialist war, or using representative heuristics to create coalitions of resistance against oppressors. And here, I think that one of the most successful recent examples in the last uh, 30 years of this has been the creation of coalitions of resistance through the use of representative heuristics by the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, which, though created in the early 1990s by Zapotecs and Mixtec migrants in California, now federates various diasporic indigenous groups in California and their sister communities in Mexico, and has collaborated with the United Farm Workers to better the conditions not only of migrant indigenous workers in California, but also those of other agricultural workers, and also the conditions basically of their sister communities in Oaxaca. So I think that the works of Flores Magon really provide us with some very valuable resources to develop transnational organizations that enable us to really build communities of resistance against oppression, particularly for the most vulnerable ones.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm wondering this notion that you bring up, right? That one of the central insights to take from his insurrectionist ethics is to think about poverty in this kind of structural way as
Mhm.
a tool of an unjust capitalist system to uh, create servitude in this sense. I mean, I think that this flies a fairly starkly in the face of a certain kind of American attitude, right? That poverty is largely a matter of personal failing,
Yes.
right? So, in some sense, this makes sense then to sort of think about him as an insurrectionist ethicist, because this is really trying to undermine certain kinds of cultural understandings, at least in the United States, that and in Mexico to some extent too.
Yes.
Right, that if you're poor, it's your fault. That you haven't worked hard enough.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. In Mexico, there might be a variety of other sorts of things that you can sort of put the blame on for the failure of your own family or your own success.
Well, I
Um,
mean, sorry that I interrupt, but I mean,
no,
there has been traditionally in Mexico a picture of Amerindians as lazy,
yeah,
as yes, and I think that Flores Magon's work really is can be transformative in showing to us and making to us clear that, as you mentioned, poverty is not a matter of individual choice or a moral failing, but rather a structural tool for controlling the masses in order to ultimately keep them um, obedient, and in order to extract resources from them in order to commodify them, in particular their labor.
yeah. A couple of things I wanted to say about this that makes me think about. One is that I think this kind of discussion has been bubbling up in
Mhm.
say in the past 10, 15 years in the United States, particularly around issues having to do with debt. So I remember back in the Occupy movement, back in 2011, a lot of discussions about thinking about debt. Right after the sort of the real estate bubbles blew up, many people were put out of work in the recession that started in 2009. This kind of question of like what caused this failure. Was it people's inability to work hard or to save, or was it in fact the kind of speculative real estate market that had been created, a structure
Mhm.
that in fact was immiserating so many people, and particularly people of color in the United States, or people that were hit very
Indeed.
heavily by that real estate bubble bursting in 2008. So this kind of question that we've been having in the past, say, 10 years about questions about debt, I think resonates in some sense with these kinds of insights of Flores Magon, the sort of question about like, why is there debt in this country?
Mhm.
And whom does it serve? And I
Exactly.
and
Yes.
and I know that I've heard this from my own students when they talk about student debt. So here's another aspect of this kind of
Mhm.
question about debt is how, when I speak with them about this and I hear back from them, how much they feel their life choices are constrained
Right.
by the kinds of debt structures that they face with higher education. And we've seen in the past 3 or 4 years like how what is such a hot potato this issue of student debt relief is through the Biden administration, back and forth, people going back, and particularly you hear the critique of debt relief by saying, look, I worked hard to pay off my debt. It's unfair that other people get their debt relieved. I
Hmm.
mean, that's all part of that idea of
Yes. Hmm.
poverty being a personal issue. So it's deeply ingrained in us, and
Exactly.
and
Yes.
to and to and to at least in the United States, right? And to think about that and to have a figure that sort of confronts that deeply, that's powerful. So
Yes.
that's a deep connection. The second thing I wanted to note about what you were saying is, and this is something I've noticed too in some of Flores Magon's writing, is a real sort of important acknowledgement of the ways in which indigenous communities organize.
Hmm.
And particularly, so while though he's not nostalgic in the sense of we need to return back to
Hmm.
sort of pre-industrial ways of social organization, he does look to the forms of solidarity created amongst indigenous communities in Mexico, and sort of says, look, it is possible for human beings to build communal societies with care embedded in social
Right.
relationships
Yes.
that sort of point to capitalism and say this is not inevitable and this is not necessarily the highest level of social evolution that we have here. We can look back and see that there have been, in some sense, much better, much more caring kinds of systems, and that the indigenous communities of Mexico can provide that kind of reminder, not necessarily as a
Right.
model to follow, but as a reminder of different sorts of social possibilities.
Indeed. And what I would add to what you said is that in uh, I think one of his addresses, one of the points that he makes is that just as poverty, another thing that ultimately chains us, and he uses this specific metaphor, is indifference. So the capitalist system, insofar as it seeks to basically atomize groups and basically turn individuals into um, things that basically do not belong to a community, but are just primarily self interested. So capitalism basically atomizes individuals, and it promotes basically a kind of indifference that is ultimately runs against the deep social instincts that we do have in virtue of being the kind of creatures that we are, and that in light of this, the forms of solidarity that we find in indigenous communities are, as you put it, perhaps not a model that we can follow, but at least a reminder that other possibilities, other alternatives basically are available to us to construct forms of social organization that uh, don't force basically individuals uh, uh, to be basically be forced to sell their labor, which is, as he points out over and over, really a form of servitude.
Yeah, and what I liked too also about what you said and about the examples that you gave was that um, the best sort of examples of people who perhaps are enacting this kind of insurrectionist ethics from a Magonista point of view might be the indigenous workers who are helping us to think about transnational community and transnational solidarity and organizing. So that creates that real important kind of bond between the global north and the global south that I think, I often talked about this in various ways. I think that there was a kind of a bit of a spark of this in the late 1990s with the global justice movement. There's a lot of
Mhm,
discussions going on about this, but then when 9/11 happened and the war on terror took place, I think a lot of the world retreated into its nationalist boundaries.
mhm,
And what we see now, throughout most of the world and in the United States, is a very strong nationalist kinds of consciousness amongst certain kinds of far right politicians who are encouraging us not to think about these kinds of boundaries. And there's another way in which this insurrectionist ethics is really important and powerful in getting us to break free from the kind of neoliberal
Mhm.
tendency to isolate us, not only as individuals, but also as national communities from one another.
Indeed, yes.
Uh, so um, there's a lot of sort of real important kind of uh, work to be done here in sort of bringing the insights of Flores Magon out.
Definitely, yes.
Well, so this is what I want to ask you about this. So I know that you've written some pieces about Flores Magon. Where do you hope to be able to take your work on Flores Magon from here on out? Do you have any other plans for analyzing his thought? Any other sorts of writing in the works?
So my work on Flores Magon has so far been circumscribed since it has mostly focused on his plays and his correspondence. In the future, I would like to engage in a far more comprehensive study of his production. So undertaking a more systematic study of his manifestos, his political addresses, his correspondence, which is very voluminous. And I would like, in particular, to study their other instances of an insurrectionary ethical stance. And in addition of continuing to analyze Flores Magon's thought, the I mean, the experience of reading him and being prompted to think by his writings in novel ways has also made me plan to engage with the thought of other Oaxacan thinkers. In particular, in the future, I would like to basically engage with the thought of the Chatino writer and community leader Tomas Cruz Lorenzo, who was a very important figure in the Chatino community in Oaxaca, whose thought that was mostly expressed in writings that he published in a publication journal that he founded, Milenio or Nuevo Milenio, I think it was called, how his thought, which has some anarchist underpinnings, but also which is deeply embedded in indigenous values and roots, can provide potentially some insights as to how we can develop forms of resistance against basically the structures that continue to immiserate us, in particular capitalism, which not only immiserates us, but is also destroying our planet at an accelerated pace, and help us basically, and using these resources, help us devise or implement potential solutions that uh, uh, would enable us to construct better alternatives for the future.
Yeah, that's extremely important work, I think. And what's interesting too is that, as you said, the production of Flores Magon was just so voluminous, and there,
Mhm.
and what's interesting is the sort of transnational organizing that he himself did, partly as a
Yes.
result of
Mhm.
his exile. Um, does this have any kind of resonance for you, as well as someone who grew up in Mexico?
Mhm.
And but works primarily in the United States. Does this work speak to you in any kind of personal sense?
Yes, I mean, it does speak to me in a personal sense on many levels. Just to mention a couple of these levels. I Part of what I have been working on over the past few years is in building bridges between Latin American traditions of thought and North American traditions of thought, because I think that there is a lot to be gained by putting figures, basically, of both traditions in conversation with each other. In fact, this is precisely what I'm doing. This is precisely what I have been doing by using the insurrectionary ethicist lens developed by Leonard Harris to study the work of Flores Magon. So, uh, I think that, and here I'm trying to apply basically Flores Magon's insight in the sense that. we can create basically better alternatives by looking at what others have done, by engaging in conversation with others uh, at a philosophical level. So this is something that deeply resonates with me, and I've tried to use that as a guide for my work over the past few years. Now, on another level, um, the interaction um, between Flores Magon and many of his contemporaries. I mean, he was actually a friend of Emma Goldman, who was a very important figure in US anarchism, is, I think, representative of the kind of, you know, transnational work that we can engage in order to, as Flores Magon and Emma Goldman did in their time, to try to fight against the oppressive structures that sadly dominate our society, in order to help individuals, particularly the most oppressed and immiserated ones, to break free from the uh, chains of poverty and indifference that burden our societies and prevent us from articulating better alternatives for a common, prosperous, and shared future.
Yeah, no, I think that that's very important. What's interesting in the sort of that anarchist tradition is Emma Goldman, did do some organizing around
Mhm.
helping Flores Magon in his legal battles in
Yes.
the United
Mhm.
States. Um, but one figure that I think is really interesting, Voltaire de Claret, right, who
Mhm.
wrote a couple of essays, but one of them in particular where she said, you probably haven't been paying attention to this, but one of the most important kinds of things happening in the world today is the Mexican Revolution.
Yes.
Right, and she talks about why it's really important for people who are interested in social justice, social change, to pay attention to the ways in which developments were unfolding there, and the ways in which it had this kind of um, it offered this kind of beacon of hope for the
Mhm.
possibility of uh, uh, marginalized peoples and historically oppressed peoples taking control of history and trying to create a different kind of social organization. So she pointed out, right, that this is something that we ought to be paying attention to.
Mhm. Yes. Mhm.
And so I think that that's really sort of in the spirit of your work, is that there's something really important to pay attention to, not simply as a historical project, but that there are some real insights here that we need, currently speaking, given the ways in which capitalism has unfolded, and in the ways in which it's immiserating people today in the forms of late capitalism, and particularly the sort of after effects of capitalist production, which are creating an inhospitable planet.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, those are that's fascinating work. Well, I want to respect your time, Sergio, and I appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you for helping us to understand a little bit about the importance of Flores Magon as a thinker, and just appreciate it. We'll try to put some links to make people have opportunity to contact you if they have any questions or thoughts. But I want to just say thank you very much for being here with us today.
Fue un gusto. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. And thank you too for listening and watching us here on the Anarres Project. You can follow the Anarres Project on all social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or you can find us at our website, which is anarresproject.org. Leave us some comments. Tell us what you think. If you've read, if you've studied, or you're interested in more of the thoughts of Ricardo Flores Magon, let us know. And we hope that you will be able to continue in our conversations with us. Thank you once again.